Hello YouTube, Dave here again. So as you can tell by the title of today's video, I want to talk a little bit about sort of my own personal retrospective on the Eberron campaign setting. Now this isn't going to be necessarily a history of or going into a lot of depth or detail about the unique aspects of Eberron or trying to explain how it's different from other campaign settings. What I really wanted to focus on was just sort of my thoughts and feelings about the setting itself, how those changed over time, and actually discuss the campaign that I had. Was a homebrew campaign that I designed for the Eberron setting. That was actually, the whole point of it was to answer the major question of what happened to Zendrick and the fall of the giant empire, as well as what happened on the day of mourning. And I, had a concept that I thought was sort of interesting for that. So I'll talk a little bit about the actual campaign that I ran there. I did relate one story already with the aspect of Dagon, I think it was, and the fight, how that went, which was not well. But so for this one, like I said, this isn't going to be a comprehensive history. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the actual uniqueness of the Eberron setting and the things that really make it stand out. This is going to be just sort of my own personal experience. So without further ado, considering that Eberron has evolved into one of my favorite settings, it might be interesting for some of you to know that I actually really hated the idea of it when it was first announced. So Eberron was the winner of a game design contest, and there was like 10,000 people, I think, or more that submitted entries, and it was like a one-page treatment that they sent in to Wizards of the Coast describing their world. And it whittled down from like 10,000 to I think like 100, and then down to 10. And the winner ended up being Keith Baker, and the setting that he created was Eberron. And the first experience I ever had with Eberron was seeing a little blurb about it in Dragon magazine. Now I have the Dragon magazine issue that it's in, but I don't know exactly which one it is off the top of my head. And honestly, it's a lot to try to dig through those right now. But I think it was like a 2 or 4 page section of the magazine, and it was filled with concept art. And some of the art was good, and some of it was kind of weird. And it was just, everything was imagine a world. And I'm not gonna lie, at first I thought it was a little pretentious. It was like, and some of these things were just, imagine a world that fits the regular D&D tropes as it is. Like, imagine a world with elves, dwarves, and halflings, and imagine a world fresh from, a major war or conflict, and imagine there's just a lot of really weird sort of things about it, or things that I was like, well, that's just any other campaign setting. And looking back at it now, I think the actual intent of those things where it's like imagine a world and it's something that we're all used to in Dungeons and Dragons, wasn't to try to make the setting seem different. It was to make you feel comfortable with the familiar. So that definitely went over my head at the time, and I'm assuming looking back that was the intention behind it. If I'm wrong, then I guess I just kind of put my own meaning in there. But then there were some other things. It was like, imagine a world where, magic sees everyday use, and, it was used to make everybody's life easier. And along with these concept arts, you had like halflings on dinosaurs. You had like a bullet train, or like an actual locomotive that you could see. It had like flying ships. It had, just all these things, and it had magical robots. It was the setting that had the magical robots, which we know now is the Warforged. And I just remember I was really put off by it at the time. And, around the time that Eberron came out, I was really starting to get into collecting things like the Forgotten Realms, and I picked up the Dragonlance campaign setting. And I liked those more traditional or conventional settings. It's something that had appealed to me because it was the kind of world that I felt comfortable in. And so Eberron came out, and, a whole bunch of books had been released, and I just had no interest in it whatsoever. And I would go to my local game store pretty much every Friday, and a lot of times the conversation would turn to Eberron, and how it was just a little bit too different, something that just didn't really appeal to any of us. And that sort of changed when one of my friends managed to pick up a few of the books for, like he picked up the campaign setting and a couple of other books, and some of the adventures, I think, for the price of just the campaign setting alone. So, you know, for I think it was like 3 books and 2 adventures or something like that. So at that point, you know, you couldn't really lose, I guess. And he started trying to get me interested in it. Although, admittedly, his sales tactics were not the best, because he was still trying to use the parts of it that I was the least comfortable with as the reasons why I should be interested in it. But anyway, so I just for quite a while, I just didn't really want anything to do with it. You know, I didn't like all the Warforged. I didn't like, you know, how they were kind of being pushed as like the driving force behind the setting, or using a lot of the artwork, or using a lot of the promotional material. It just wasn't something that was of interest to me. But I still consider myself to be a collector at that point. And one of the book series that I was collecting for 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons was the Races series of books. So you had like Races of the Stone, Races of Destiny, and Races of the Wild. And those were really, really great books. And they fleshed out the playable races quite well, and had like a lot of just really excellent flavor text. And I saw in a preview catalog put out by Wizards of the Coast, they were going to be doing a book called Races of Eberron. Now, I also had Races of Faerun, and the Races of Faerun book was designed to look like the other Forgotten Realms books. But when I was looking at this picture in this catalog, the Races of Eberron looked like just a regular D&D 3.5 supplement. And it's like, you know, I really love those other races of books. And it's just like, you know what? It's not the Eberron style. It's something that I feel like I could still maybe get some enjoyment out of, but it's also part of a series that I had already started collecting. So part of this video, like I said, I want to show off the Eberron collection that I have, and the first book that I ever owned for the Eberron campaign setting was, and we'll just pan down here a little bit, Races of Eberron. And as you can see, this has the same book style as the rest of the 3.5 books. And this was the turning point for me, because this information here was just so well written and so enjoyable that even the Warforged became a race that I actually kind of liked. And you know, just reading their backstory and you know, their just sort of, you know, their history and everything else, it was just really kind of actually interesting. And this book was, again, something that just made me, it softened my position on Eberron just a little bit. So I decided, you know what, that's fine. You know, I'll get this book, and I may as well get the campaign setting, because, you know, at the very least with this book and the campaign setting, you know, if I ever do decide to run something in Eberron, I'll have all the information I need. So that brings me to the next book in my Eberron collection, which is obviously the Eberron campaign setting. Now, as you can see, Warforged right on the front cover. And that was one of the things that just kind of turned me off from the very beginning. It's just like, you know, I don't think I like that. I just wasn't a fan of them at the time, so having them like right front and center, kind of shoved in your face, was, to me, it was just a little bit too much. And it would have been nice to have seen something a little bit different, something to maybe ease you in a little bit more. But I started reading through this book, and you know what? I really started to like it. I started to like, you know, the setting. I started to like the flavor of it, and it was a really enjoyable read. And it's like, you know what? At this point, I'm more or less hooked. So, you know, I decided I was going to get the campaign setting. There is an adventure built into the campaign setting book itself, and quite frankly, and I decided that, you know what, I might decide to continue and maybe just run the adventure in there. And they had a couple of other adventures that were released at the time as well. So we'll just go right to them here. So the first one was Shadows of the Last War. And I think this one picked up pretty much right where the adventure in the campaign setting book left off. And it's like, okay, well, you know what, this again is something that I didn't mind. I kind of liked the adventure, although there were a few elements of it that I wasn't necessarily a huge fan of, and I don't think I ran the adventure properly. mainly because it was a period of time in my life where it was just, I didn't have a lot of time to prepare the stuff. It was just a lot of like, long, 12, 14-hour days at work. So anyway, so I picked up Shadows of the Last War. It was the first of a trilogy. So the second adventure in the series was Whispers of the Vampire's Blade. So this was the second adventure. I never actually got to run this one. Whoops, didn't mean to bump the camera there. And honestly, it's one of those things I actually want to go back and take the time to thoroughly read now, because I just missed out on it, and never got a chance to really sit down and enjoy it. And again, this is something that one of these days I wouldn't mind going back and actually running this stuff. So this was the second one in the series. Third one, and the conclusion was Grasp of the Emerald Claw by Bruce R. Cordell. And I'm a really big fan of Bruce Cordell's work. So again, unfortunately, I never really got a chance to read this, but it's something that, again, it was part of that trilogy, so I felt pretty much obligated to get it. Now, in addition, and we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but in addition, there was another one of these thinner modules put out a couple of years later, I think it was, after the release, and it was Voyage of the Golden Dragon. So this doesn't necessarily follow the rest in the series, and it came out in 2006, so the other stuff came out around 2003, 2004. So this came out quite a while later, but it involves basically this massive luxury skyship, and plans, I think, to hijack it or something. It's been years since I looked at this. It's been actually over a decade, but there you go. It's in my collection. So pretty much at that point, the floodgates had opened. In addition, I also picked up the Dungeon Master screen for Eberron, and it's something that you can actually see in the background here. I think I'd shown it off in other videos. This is just the sleeve that came over it. And if you wanted the campaign setting map, the only way to get the map was actually with the DM screen. There was an issue of Dungeon Magazine that had a map of Corvair, but there wasn't much to it. It was a very simple, smaller map. So if you wanted the the official one, or the really nice map that you can get for the setting, you had to get the DM screen. It was not in the campaign setting book like the Forgotten Realms one was, for example. All right, so moving on. We're just going to kind of go through these a little bit quicker here, and these are the order that I actually have them on my shelf, with the exception of a couple books here, which I'll get to at the end. But the next thing that I want to show off here was one of the later releases, actually, for the Eberron setting. And this was a massive standalone kind of super adventure for Eberron. This is Eyes of the Lich Queen. And so this one, I don't think there was any pull-out maps that came with it. But so this one was actually kind of along the same lines. It was the same sort of size as City of the Spider Queen, which was the Forgotten Realms sort of mega adventure. And so this is well over, I think it's 120 some odd pages. And really, really cool adventure. It's been a long time since I've read through it. But again, something that I would not mind running. And this is a 5th level adventure, which I want to say almost fits in with some of the earlier ones as well. Maybe not the entire trilogy, but again, really, really cool. Again, nice to have these nice, massive mega adventures. This was also late in the 3.5 life cycle, so they had all the encounters broken down by these tactical maps, which doesn't really do it for me, but still really, really cool product. So glad to have that in my collection as well. All right, up next we are getting into the hardcovers. So the only hardcover book that I do not have for Eberron is the what was the name of it now? The Eberron Survival Guide, I think it was called. And all that was an art book. It wasn't an actual supplement. So I felt okay with not picking that up. But I picked up pretty much everything else that had come out for it as far as hardcovers are concerned. So we're just going to kind of rapid fire through these. But we have the Player's Guide to Eberron, which I think is a really important book. If you want to run the setting and you want your players to be familiar with it, this is a great book for them to have. There's also the Explorer's Handbook, And this one was actually a really good one too, and it had this really nice sort of whimsical introduction. I'm not actually going to read it off here, but it was just something that I really thought was kind of funny, and it was just you know, trying to goad you into adventuring and not wasting your time reading the introduction. So really cool book. Yeah, I actually like these covers, and I like the style of the covers. I like the spines. You know, they look cool on the shelf, and they again, I think they color coded the books as well, like they did for a lot of stuff back in 3rd edition. So these green books here, and I don't know how well the green's going to show up on camera. I'm recording this at night, so the lighting's not super great. But these green books were all pretty much player focused. So these are the ones that, you know, your players could have, and it would almost be sort of expected that, you know, these were the books that your players would pick up, whereas the other stuff was sort of all a DM or a combination. So we had those, and of course one of the big parts of the Eberron setting are the dragon marked houses. Now again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about them, or very much detail at all at this point, but they did have their own book that came out. So this is Eberron Dragon Marked, and again another one of the green covered books, which I'm assuming is again oriented towards players because it sort of makes sense based on what we have here. And you know, $29.95. That was the U.S. price for these things back in the day. So I don't think we're going to see those days again, unfortunately. Now the next book that I picked up here. Now this one, I can't remember if this is the one that came with it or not, but yeah, it was. So this is Sharn City of Towers, and Sharn is kind of like one of the major cities in Eberron. It's kind of equivalent to like Baldur's Gate or Waterdeep in the Forgotten Realms, or even the city of Greyhawk itself in Greyhawk. It's just like, it's kind of that iconic city for the Eberron setting. So it had its own book with it, or for it, dedicated solely to this city. Now it also came with an audio soundtrack CD, which I no longer have, and you might be able to see sort of the marks where the glue sort of held it in there. Unfortunately, it fell out, and it was packed away. I packed the CD away, but after several moves, like 5 moves in 5 years, something had kind of shifted in the box, and something fell on it, and it actually cracked the CD itself. So I can no longer use the CD. I still have it somewhere. I didn't throw it out, but it's at this point it's unfortunately useless. But it did come with a soundtrack. I'm sure you can find the soundtrack itself on YouTube. So along with, now these were black covered books, and I think these were sort of your regional source books. And I think they started changing the color from black to maybe like a darkish blue. This one's definitely black, but the next one that I want to show here is 5 Nations. And again, it's sort of more of like a dark navy blue. But again, this was another fantastic book because the Continent of Corvair is one of my favorites, just overall. And the history between the 5 Nations, I think, was really cool. So this goes into detail about all of that, and the locations there, and some of the notable NPCs and events from their past. So one of the other cool things about Eberron is that it's very recently out of like a centuries-long war. So there's still a lot of tensions and a lot of political issues that you can kind of have to come across, or you know, prance around to not, you know, cause an international or an incident where, you know, it sparks the war again. So the next book that I want to show, I'm actually going to set this one off to the side because it's out of order. So the next one I want to show off here is Secrets of Xen'drik. So Xen'drik was a continent overrun by, or not overrun, but controlled by giants, and it was actually the continent where the campaign setting the campaign that I had run was actually based in. And so this was a really useful book. I loved this one absolutely to death, and I believe it was the Colossal, no, I don't think it was the Colossal Monument, but what actually gave me the inspiration to run a Xen'drik based campaign was a location. Let's see if I can find it here, but it may not be. That actually might be the one. But it was it was basically the statue. This you know, the giant. It was a shrine to some sort of like giant And there was this throne in there that could potentially give you visions of the future. And so that's kind of what I went with, was, being able to, it was having it kind of give visions of the past and the future and how to kind of bring back this very important character. And I'll discuss that when I get into the actual campaign itself when I talk about it. But yeah, I don't think I'm going to find it easily. That's probably what it was, actually. I probably opened right up to it, and I just got away from it. So I'm not going to try to find it again because it's just way too difficult. But that was sort of the catalyst that really got me thinking and was the basis for the campaign that I ran. Now, Secrets of Zendrick was good, but the other Secrets book that came out, I think, was actually even better, and that is Secrets of Sarlona. I had actually talked about this a couple weeks ago for the DM's Guild print-on-demand spotlight, so I absolutely love this book. And I don't think I had it at the time that I went to run my Eberron campaign. I don't know if it had been out at that point. 2007, yeah, I don't think it was actually out when I was planning the campaign that I was going to run. So, but it is something that if I had it at the time, I'm sure I would have tried to find a way to integrate it, because this is a really great, really great book. So those were the every book that I'd shown there were ones that I absolutely loved. Actually, sorry, there is one more. I'll show that off now. And this was the final actual hardcover source book that they put out for Eberron in 3.5, and that was The City of Stormreach. Now, this was around the time that they were getting ready to move to D&D 4th edition. So as you can see, they have, D&D Insider, which was a big part of the 4th edition system. And I believe that the D&D Online had already been out. And I don't think they reference it at all in this, but basically D&D Online was set in Stormreach, and this was this regional source book for the city. Stormreach is a major settlement on Zendrick, and it's probably one of them, I think it's the only human city on that entire continent. It's one that basically you go from Sharn to Stormreach, and then you can explore the continent from there. So there we go. So like I said, all those books were ones that I consider to be absolutely excellent. Unfortunately, there were a few other ones that just weren't as good, in my opinion. But I do have them, so we're just going to show them off really quickly. So the first one here is Magic of Eberron. This was actually a book that I had passed on originally. I just wasn't really interested in it. It was by Bruce Cordell, and I do really enjoy his work, but I just wasn't a huge fan of a lot of the stuff that was in here. And from my friend who actually got this with the campaign setting, when he first started kind of turning around on Eberron, I don't think he was too keen on this book either. So it was just one of those ones that I didn't consider myself to be a collector of Eberron, so I felt comfortable just letting that one go. But eventually it's like, well, that's one of the only ones missing from my collection. So I picked this up in Toronto, actually, along with the Eyes of the Lich Queen and City of Stormreach. So I actually completed my my collection at that point. But it was, again, one that I kind of passed on, and it's still not really my favorite, and it's one that I would still say you could probably pass up on even today. Another one that was disappointing, really disappointing actually, was Faiths of Eberron. Now, the Faiths and Pantheons from the Forgotten Realms, 3rd edition book, was one of my favorites. Deities Demigods was kind of garbage compared to it, and this one, it doesn't have stats for the gods, because gods are more of an abstract concept in Eberron, which is fine, but the religions themselves just weren't great, or weren't really described in the best way. And I shouldn't say religions, because it really came down to the one religion, which was the Sovereign Host. And the Sovereign Host was a group of gods that were usually worshipped together as a collective. So, no one particular god was favored over the others. People would pray to the individual gods for individual tasks that they were associated with, but the collective as a whole was worshipped. And the biggest thing is that they, their reward for being faithful and adhering to the tenets of the faith was that you basically went to the Eberron equivalent of purgatory. and your punishment for not following the tenets was also to be sent to that kind of purgatory area. And it's something that the creator, Keith Baker, actually had said when I sent him some questions. He had actually said that he would have liked to have seen that described a little bit better, because he did have it, he did explain it in a way that made sense, but this was a book that he wasn't actually involved with. So it just made like the biggest religion, one of the biggest religions in the setting, feel kind of not worth it. Because, you know, faith in the afterlife and what happens, you know, when you shed the mortal coil is one of the driving forces behind most religions. And the Dark Six, which was the evil version, or the evil, you know, counterpart to the Sovereign Host, actually had a better afterlife for its followers. So it just wasn't presented very well. Now, pretty much all the other religions were actually described in pretty awesome detail. So I always found myself initially feeling disappointed by this book, and then I remember, you know, it really was just that one faith that was really kind of disappointing. But the rest of the book overall was actually pretty good. Another actually really good one is The Forge of War. And this was one that I really actually like as well. It's sort of a timeline of the Eberron setting, as well as some information on running some historical-based campaigns. So if you want to run them during some of the other eras of conflict, then you could do that. You didn't actually have to base it on sort of like the modern day. So there was like the Last War campaign, and I think there was other stuff as well, I think. But again, it's a really, really cool book, and you know, I'm glad that I picked it up. It was, I think, again, one of the last ones that I actually bought. This was actually the last one I think that I bought brand new, if I recall correctly. But again, this one is actually really worth getting. And then the last one here for 3.5 is, again, a little bit on the disappointing side. This is Dragons of Eberron. And initially it was, I think one of the early titles for it was like the Dragons of Argonasson. And I probably pronounced that wrong, but it's basically the continent where the dragons thrive. And it has some stuff about it, but it wasn't the regional source book that I was hoping it was going to be. And it just, for me, I just wasn't as thrilled with this one as I was other books. And I think things like the Draconomicon were much better. I liked the Dragons of Faerun book a little bit better than this. And again, for me, the fact that this went from initially being marketed, or in the early stages when it was first announced, it was going to be like that other continental source book, and it just deviated a little bit too far from that, which is a shame, but there you go. So those were my 3.5 books, and just really quickly, the last couple things that I want to show off here are for 4th edition. So, and yes, again, I'm one of those people who I actually, you know, liked 4th edition once I gave it a chance. And one of the things that I actually kind of liked about 4th edition is that they didn't overdo it with their campaign settings. So the only 2 hardcover books released for Eberron in 4th edition were the Eberron campaign setting. And again, this was a really excellent book. You know, fantastic campaign setting. I have the map somewhere. I think it's in one of my folders. But this one was actually really, really good. And I kind of liked the information, the flavor text, in this one a little bit better than the original. But this, again, was a really, really fantastic book. And then finally, we have the Eberron Player's Guide. So we have that as well. So this was, again, your player's book. The campaign setting for 4th edition didn't have any of the player character stuff or materials in there in terms of like races and class ops, stuff like that. So that was all in this book. And again, really, really cool book, really decent book. And I know it's 4th edition, but I liked it. I gave it a chance. I'm glad I did. And the 2 books that they put out for it, I thought were really good quality. The last thing I want to show off here is the just the, I guess, the comic trade. But this is Eberron Annual 2012. So this was a comic put out by IDW. And I think they had done a 2011 one as well, but I don't have that. But this has, I think his name is Abraxas Wren. And I just absolutely Yeah, Abraxas Ren. And so he's sort of an investigator, and his character is just so good. You know, he's just so kind of like cocky and arrogant and full of himself and self-assured, and just again a really, really awesome character. And this was a great comic as well. I also have the issues of Infestation. There was like two comics for the Eberron setting, and the kind of crossed the Cthulhu mythos sort of idea, Lovecraftian horrors, into the Eberron world, but those are also packed away somewhere. So anyway, that was my Eberron collection, and I'm going to be honest, this video's gone a little bit longer than I thought it was going to, so I'm actually going to wrap this up here for now, and come back tomorrow, and I will go over the Eberron campaign that I had run back in, I think it was like 2005 or 2006 maybe, but anyway, I'll discuss that one in more detail tomorrow. So anyway, thank you guys very much for watching, and let me know in the comments below what your thoughts on the Eberron campaign setting are. If you were, you know, against it when it first came out, if you kind of came around on it, or what some of your favorite or least favorite elements of the setting really are. So let me know that in the comments below. I look forward to reading, and we'll see you next time. Take care.